Fiona Bruce.
A new chapter has been opened in British political history. A brand new Labour government with a huge majority. The Conservatives effectively demolished. The rise of the smaller parties, the Lib Dems, in terms of MPs, and reform in terms of votes. What does it all mean for the future of our country? Welcome to Question Time. On our panel, from the new Labour government, we have the Cabinet Secretary, Steve Reid. The Labour Party, of course, have a majority of 174, and Steve is Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Lord Daniel Finkelstein is a Conservative peer and former advisor to John Major, William Hague and David Cameron. He's also a columnist for The Times and a director of Chelsea FC. Daisy Cooper is the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats. Her party had a very successful night and are now the third party in the House of Commons by some distance, with 71 MPs, likely by tomorrow to be 72. Ben Habib is Deputy Leader of Reform UK. His party won over 4 million votes last night and now has 5 MPs. And Andrew Marr is a writer, broadcaster and journalist. Previously, of course, political editor of the BBC and editor of The Independent. He now has an evening radio show on LBC and is political editor of the left-leaning New Statesman magazine. So, good evening. Welcome to our panellists, welcome to our audience here, and of course, welcome to you at home. All change. So this is going to be the first question I have done with a Labour government. So let's get started with our first question from Jazz Shoka.
Will this country really be any better under a Labour government?
Well, as Secretary of State here, Steve, Cabinet Secretary, let's have your answer. Will this country be any better under Labour government?
Yes, it absolutely has to be. I mean, we've gone... This government just elected yesterday, we've been appointed today. It has the worst inheritance of any incoming government in recent decades because of what the Conservative Party was doing. I mean, it was a carnival of chaos for 14 years. Since 2016, we had 5 prime ministers, 7 chancellors of the Exchequer. They broke their own lockdown rules, they broke our public services, they crashed the economy, and they left British people to pay the price for all of that. They, at every turn, would put their party before the interests of the country as they fought like ferrets in a sack against each other, rather than fighting for the British people.
But it's all about you now. It's not about the Conservatives anymore.
It's all about
you.
It's all about us.
So Jazz's question is, will this country really be any better under Labour government? You're not going to have much more money, that's for sure.
The British people called time on that chaos yesterday, and you saw Keir Starmer's speech outside 10 Downing Street today. A very different approach, a government of service, a government that will put the British people first at every turn. And we'd already outlined, Keir had outlined, what the first steps in a decade of national renewal would look like. I mean, I won't go through all of them because I suspect we don't have the time. The most important one is to stabilise the economy. So what Labour would never do would be irresponsible about the commitments we would be making to the British people, because that's what the Conservatives did, that's what Liz Truss did, that's what crashed the economy. There will be stability, and therefore everything in our manifesto will be costed. But another very big one, which will deliver big change, is setting up GB Energy to harness the power of wind, wave, solar and nuclear energy, take back control of energy in our own country, no more dependency on fossil fuels that put us at the mercy of foreign dictators like Vladimir Putin. But importantly, it allows us to create jobs up and down this country, good, secure, well-paid jobs, but cut energy bills for households to help them with the cost of living crisis, for businesses to give them a boost to get the economy moving. With practical changes like that, a change in the way we do politics, but a change in the politics we do, so that we're directly helping the British people for the long term.
Danny.
I sincerely and desperately hope so. I think it's in the
Well, you're saying that as a Conservative.
Yeah, I think it's in the interest of every person in the country that the government is successful. But more than that, I think where there's been a feeling in this country that people feel it's broken. I actually not sure that I concur completely with that sentiment, but you can't miss it. And I think it's problem for everybody living in a country which we don't have optimism about, and optimism is so important. I also, frankly, hope that a pragmatic and moderate and reasonable approach, which is the one that the Prime Minister laid out today outside Downing Street, I want that to be successful because that's where my politics are too. I've obviously got questions about Labour's approach, and there will also be all the challenges that the Conservative Party faced, which are hard, which the Conservative Party didn't have a solution to, partly because of the Conservative Party's failings, but partly because the problems are difficult.
Well, give us a for instance.
Well, OK, I'll give you a for instance, which is, for example, there's a widespread feeling that we want to secure our borders, but there's also a feeling that we want to abide by international obligations, and we want to be compassionate and reasonable to people who want to come here to seek asylum. Balancing all those things with our international obligations is extremely difficult. And Labour will have that problem. A second example is that the current projections are that we will reduce public spending over the next 2 or 3 years. Labour's made a lot of promises necessary to win the general election and pressed by Tories to make them on tax. And if you have those two things together, it's going to be quite a difficult situation for lots of public services. So there are obviously real questions that can be asked of anybody. But Labour's won fair and square the opportunity to address those. I think it's started off talking about them in a mature way, and I very much hope that that approach is successful.
Just let me ask you, since you asked the question. No, let's get the microphone. Please stay with Jan. Since you asked this question, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm a bit of both, to be honest. I'm optimistic. I think there's some good ideas that Labour have, and I think there's some substance in the policy, but I'm not convinced they will actually be able to deliver on those ideas and their manifesto. I think that I think it's going to take something a little bit more drastic and almost seismic to adjust from where we are, and I haven't really heard that in Labour's policies. I think there's some good ideas there for me, but you know, obviously the proof is in the pudding. Will they be able to deliver on those?
The person here. Yes.
This country needs some optimism and some hope, and I think it's obvious you're stepping into a difficult place. But if the talk track of the next 5 years is, look what we've been left with, you're just going to turn even more people off politics. So focus on the positive, focus on what we're going to have, not what you've been left with.
For sure.
OK. And in the T-shirt, you had your hand up. Yes.
If the Labour government says that it's not going to raise taxes, how is it going to afford to basically make our country better?
All right, I'll come back to you on that, because I think you've been asked that a lot during the
Yeah.
Yes, man there in the dark suit.
So I know there's a lot of promises to invest more in public services. I think, for me, the NHS is a big one. It was reported that there's been 180,000 operations that were cancelled last year. So it'd be interesting, apart from just the investment, what the plans will be to make sure we're on course again with the NHS.
So Andrew, I mean, this is the question that, and I'll come back to you on this, Steve, as well. This is a question that dogged Labour throughout the campaign. How are you going to be able to afford these things? Where are you going to get the money from? Do you need to be more radical?
Absolutely. Well, a couple of sources of optimism, because I completely agree with the questionnaire. We have to be optimistic looking forward. I think just having a stable government that will be there for 5, maybe 10 years, who knows, but with sort of ordinary, down-to-earth, serious people talking like the rest of us in charge of the government, and a plan that doesn't shift very much for investment, is going to mean a wall of money coming into this country from around the world. You look at the chaos going on the continent, particularly in France. You look at the chaos likely ahead in the United States. And suddenly, for once, for the first time in many of our lives, actually Britain looks like a little haven of peace and stability. And that in itself is going to draw money into this country. But I think on taxes, the truth is they are going to raise taxes. They're going to raise inheritance tax. They're going to raise value-added tax, not value-added tax, I beg your pardon. You're going to raise council taxes, I think. You're going to raise wealth taxes of different kinds, capital gains tax in particular, because that investment is a slow process. And we're going to get a lot of new building in this country. We're going to get new infrastructure, and we're going to get new housing. But you do need to solve, the Labour Party does need to solve some of the imminent spending crises ahead. And they include the fact that there are at least 2 universities in this country on the edge of going under. They include the huge crisis with the country's biggest water company, Thames Water. And they include, of course, the crisis in the NHS with the junior doctors. Now, I think by tomorrow, Wes Streeting, the new health secretary, is intending to get round the table with the junior doctors and do a deal. But there is no way that they're going to be able to afford the 35% that the junior doctors are asking for. But they are going to have to come up with real new money and fast. And I think those kinds of things mean that quite quickly, perhaps by the autumn, the new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, first female Chancellor in our history, is going to have to raise some taxes.
And what about our relationship with Europe?
The relationship with Europe is the single biggest issue, I think, facing the new House of Commons. And it's going to be a really, really tough one for Keir Starmer. Daisy Cooper's party, 72 seats, a really big block of MPs. We haven't talked enough about the Liberal Democrats in this campaign. Sorry, Daisy, but we haven't.
I agree.
But if you look at their manifesto on tax, on Europe, on the NHS, on social care, it is clearly well to the left of Keir Starmer's party. Now, you think of a group of 70 MPs, therefore, to the left of Keir Starmer's party, and maybe 9 or 10 Scottish nationalists as well, and then think of them starting to make common cause with some Labour MPs to the left of the party. I think you have a very interesting situation there. And it's with this huge majority that these guys have got now, of course, Keir Starmer can start to look at a more creative relationship with the EU, start to think, can we come under the European Court to allow trade to work better? What can I do? The Liberal Democrats will be pressing him, lots of other MPs will be pressing him, but he's also thinking of Ben Habib and Reform UK and the millions upon millions of people who voted for them. He's in a real bind over this, I think.
Daisy, would you agree with that?
Well, what I can tell you is that we Liberal Democrats stood on our own platform during the general election. We don't define ourselves in relation to any other party, and we were absolutely clear during the general election campaign as to what our priorities were during the general election and after the general election. We said we had a plan to save our NHS and social care, to take real action on the cost of living and to protect our local environment, including putting an end to the raw sewage scandal. So the thing that we have asked for already is for an emergency health and social care budget, because we as Liberal Democrats spoke to millions of people over the last few months and years, and the number one issue that comes up time and time again is the state of our NHS. It is on its knees, and we hear from people they can't see a GP, they can't see a dentist, their child is on a mental health waiting list, they can't get a social care package, and we have got to have a real sense of urgency. And every single Liberal Democrat MP who has just been elected, all 71, possibly 72 of them, is going to have NHS and social care as their number one priority. We've taken our marching orders from the public on this, and I can promise you we're going to fight on this day in, day out.
And Daisy, can I say, you're an experienced parliamentarian. Although you stood on your own platform, these are your policies and nobody else's, you know that in the House of Commons, the new House of Commons, which is the most left-wing House of Commons we have had for a very long time, you're going to need to form alliances. You're going to need to talk to MPs from other parties to get what you want.
Well, it's entirely possible, but with 71, 72 MPs, we hope to have a huge amount of influence.
Exactly.
In the last
But that will be
Parliament,
through the form of alliances, surely.
Well, look, in the last Parliament, when we were a much smaller party, just 15 of us, we actually had a huge amount of influence. We were the first party to call for the windfall tax on the big oil and gas companies. That was copied by Labour, then the Conservatives. We were the first party to call for the energy price hike to be scrapped, copied by Labour, then the Conservatives. The first party to put the sewage scandal on the political agenda. That's what we did with 15 MPs. Now we've got more than 70. Imagine the influence that we could have in this Parliament. And NHS and social care will be our number one issue.
I don't think your influence will be as great as you think, because you made a decision. I think the reason why lots of people voted Liberal Democrats is because they were the anti-Tory party where they happened to live. And therefore they voted Liberal Democrat. You put yourself in that position. It was an intelligent strategy, and it's obviously worked. But also, it's yielded the Labour Party a massive majority, which you have deliberately decided to stay outside of. So my view is you'd have been much better off actually being... I mean, almost all Liberal Democrat voters share exactly the same views as Labour voters, polls suggest. It'd have been much better to have been in that.
Daisy's saying she doesn't agree with that.
Well, that's just what you guys suggest. So it may be wrong, but I just read it out of paper. So, and therefore, in my view, it would have been better... for very talented people, which I include obviously you and Ed Davey in, to have been inside the Labour Party, then you could have been part of the government, then you could really have been influential. But now Labour's got a massive majority. Of course, they might listen to you. So I think it's a lost opportunity.
Well, we stand on our own 2 feet. We are our own party. We have our own set of values, and we will be campaigning every day on our NHS and social care. And while I take your point that actually a number of people, millions of people, will have voted tactically in all sorts of different directions, it happens in all political parties, what we heard time and again is that millions of people voted positively for us because of our vision on the NHS and social care, the cost of living and the local environment. And we've taken our marching orders from them.
Also, I suspect you're going to have to wait a heck of a long time with Lib Dem to get into coalition again. I mean, obviously that's for you to say, but I know that you're still scarred by what happened after 2010. Ben, let's hear from you.
Yeah, so I want
that was quite a night.
Pick Steve up, if I may, on one point, which was you started off by saying that you're inheriting a state of the economy that hasn't been seen for decades. But I just want to remind you, when the Labour Party last left office, there was a banking sector crisis and £250 billion worth of bailouts had to be engineered by the Bank of England to save the banks. And actually, when Labour came to office in 1997, the country was in fantastic financial health. And when you left, it was broken. And I agree with you. You're inheriting a country now which has the highest debt since World War II, the highest levels of taxation as a percentage of GDP since World War II, 6 million people surviving on universal credit, that's 20% of the workforce. I think you have a huge challenge on your hands, and as Andrew so brilliantly set out, you're actually going to tax us even more. And what you're going to do is tax this economy into the ground. There cannot be prosperity through taxation. What we've got to do is deregulate the economy, which, by the way, won't happen under Keir Starmer because he was caught unawares in Montreal when he thought the camera wasn't on him, saying that he was going to align us completely with the European Union so that in all respects we would be marching in lockstep with them, even if we were notionally out of the EU. The EU is a bureaucratic, highly regulated organisation. So we're going to have more government spending, more taxation, more regulations from the European Union, and on top of that, what we're going to have is this drive, what I call economic emasculation, the drive to net zero, the ideological drive by 2050 to get down to net zero, turning our backs, as Boris Johnson did, on North Sea oil, North Sea gas in particular, with the North Sea transition deal in March 2021, eschewing what was readily available in the United Kingdom so that we've become, as you rightly point out, now dependent, believe it or not, on liquefied natural gas imported from the United States of America, which we could have actually got locally. And there is no mechanism by which this country can deliver its energy needs using renewables, and changing the form of ownership of those renewables won't do it. What we've got to do...
Taking climate action will deliver new jobs and economic growth, not the opposite.
All of you spoke for a very long time. What the US has done is actually champion the fossil fuel industry, become completely fossil fuel independent, is now an exporter of fossil fuels, and on the back of becoming energy independent, meeting its own national needs, it then did the biggest Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest spending package ever on the kinds of renewables which you wish to seek. But what we've done in this country... $376 billion worth of spending. What we've done in this country is turn our back on what's domestically available in the pursuit of an ideology. And we are making ourselves energy dependent and energy vulnerable.
OK. Well, there's a lot of points there, but also from Andrew in terms of taxation. So in terms of... I mean, you've got Andrew saying you're going to be raising council tax, inheritance tax, capital gains tax. You've got Ben saying you're going to be raising taxes. Let's just deal with that first of all.
Well, I mean, Ben is just conjuring up his own fantasies and then arguing against them.
OK,
it doesn't make for a very sensible debate.
You've got Andrew and Ben saying that Labour is going to raise... We know you're not going to raise VAT. You've said you're not. You've said you're not going to raise income tax. But what about these other taxes?
I'm going to say, first of all, the reason we don't want to raise taxes is because the Conservative government left working people paying the highest rates of tax for 70 years. They introduced 26 new taxes in the 4.5 years.
So how are you going to cut taxes?
That they were in power. The Tories are the taxaholics, not the Labour Party, and we got elected to help people with the cost of living crisis, not to make it worse. Everything in Labour's manifesto, the injections of cash were fully costed and fully funded.
Have you fully costed how much you're going to pay the junior doctors,
fully costed. Well,
But do you disagree?
Ben, just wait 1 second.
Have you fully costed? Wes is going to have a conversation
Have you
with them.
fully costed how much you're going to pay the junior
Wes
doctors?
is going to have a conversation with them, and Wes is going to see if he can negotiate an end to these strikes by looking at longer-term reform in the NHS. The strikes in the NHS are not just about pay. They're also about the fact that people in the NHS are having to work in completely intolerable
The junior
conditions.
doctors do want some more money. Have you
It's not just.
budgeted
It's not.
for that?
It's not just. It's not.
I know.
Just
I'm not
about
saying
pay,
that, but
it's
have
about
you
much more.
budgeted for that?
What they want to know
I
is that
think the answer must be no, because you've not given me an answer.
Wes is going to have a conversation. What they want to know is that there is a long-term plan to fix the NHS. They know it cannot be done overnight. There is no magic wand. So what Labour has proposed doing is closing the non-dom tax loophole so we can fund 40,000 additional NHS appointments every week. It's a start.
The non-doms are going to go.
They're going. Starts with the first step.
The non-doms are gone. You're not going to raise the tax. It's like your VAT on school fees. You're not going to raise the tax because actually parents will take their children out of school. And the non-doms will leave the country.
The longer-term funding comes through economic growth, and there is a plan to grow the
Andrew, you want to come back in? And then I must let the audience in, because that's what they're here for.
Can I just interpose my lissom body between these two gentlemen? Because I think...
What an image you've conjured up for us, Andrew.
In a sense,
we're all too tired.
this is the genuine argument we haven't had during the general election campaign. There's been an element of dishonesty in this because it's all been about tax and tax cuts. At the same time, we have a crumbling public sphere. We have hospitals desperately needing investment. We have prisons falling apart, bursting at the seams. We have sewage going through all of our rivers because we have badly run water companies. Right, we have a prison system that's failing. We don't get police on the streets. And all of those things, I'm afraid, need investment if we want a better, more civilised public realm, which in due course helps us produce a better and more effective economy. I'm afraid we have to be well pay for it. And we have spent the last 6 weeks pretending that's not true and pretending that you can have tax cuts or no tax increases at all and improve public services, and it just ain't the case.
Can I just... OK, why don't you...
Well, let me just bring the audience, just briefly. Yes, woman in the green top. Yeah.
In your opening words, you'd mentioned about Vladimir Putin, and so I wanted to just ask if you or anyone in the Labour Party was perhaps privy to any information that the United Kingdom may not be. So I'm just curious as to why you would mention that. And should we be privy to this information?
The reason was because it was Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine that caused such a problem with the supply of fossil fuels to the UK because of the sanctions that were put on Russia following that. If we control our own energy in this country, wind, wave, solar and nuclear, we don't have to import fossil fuels from elsewhere. We control our own energy. Then the actions of foreign dictators like Vladimir Putin don't affect us. It keeps us safer, it keeps us more secure, but it cuts energy bills as well because clean energy is cheaper than fossil energy. Even if it's drilled out of the North Sea, it's cheaper to have our own clean energy here in the UK than to drill it out of the North Sea, leaving aside the impact that that has on the climate.
The woman in the green top.
I woke up this morning feeling relieved that the Labour Party had won, but I had an overwhelming feeling of anxiety and fear, and I'm sure a lot of other people do too, about how well the Reform Party has done. And I want to hear from the Labour Party and the Lib Dems about how you're going to push back on dangerous anti-immigration right-wing rhetoric.
Well, can I address that?
All right. I will ask them, but I'll let Ben answer that first.
Well, first of all, Reform UK is not a right-wing party. And you may laugh because we've been vilified through that nomenclature. But the reality is there are two forms of government taking place now in the West. There is the global form of government, which I think most of the panel subscribe to, which is, and I think Lord Finkelstein mentioned it when he talked about the United Kingdom having to adhere to international law. The citing of international law is always done when domestic national interest is when those who govern us don't want to promote domestic national interest. They always cite international law to prohibit us from being able to do it. They are globalists. They're pro-EU, they're pro-WHO, pro-World Economic Forum, pro-UN, but they don't put the United Kingdom first. The single biggest building block, the principle on which Reform UK exists, is that we will put British national interests first. with British citizens' interests first and immigrants. And I'm an immigrant myself. Immigrants are not British citizens. And to the extent that immigration can help the United Kingdom...
Sorry, but are you saying you're not a British citizen?
No, my father is Punjabi. I am a British citizen.
Yes,
but
I
came to this country as an immigrant. So I'm not prejudiced against immigrants, was the point I was trying to make. Immigration can be a very useful tool in order to grow an economy. But when you set the minimum wage for a working visa at £26,000 per annum, which is what the Conservative Party did, and which is 25% below the median wage in this country, what you get is an influx of cheap, imported labour. That undermines the British citizens' ability to earn a fair wage.
Ben, can I just...
And we have hollowed out our economy with mass immigration. And the Labour Party will have a completely open border position.
So I think the question...
Hang on, just a minute, just a second. Since you mentioned immigration, and I appreciate you're talking about legal migration here, but I can't really have you on the panel without asking about your comments about migrants, particularly in the light of what you were saying there. So you said... in an interview, and I want to give you the chance to explain it. You were asked about migrants coming in and the policy reform, which is basically push them back to France. And when you were asked, well, look, what if they just jump out of the dinghy and they're drowning? And you said, well, they would, I'm quoting you here, they would have to suffer the consequences of their actions. And when the interviewer said, what, you'd leave them to drown, you said, absolutely.
So you haven't given the full context there. What the interviewer said was that in their attempt to get to the United Kingdom, having left France, which is a safe country, a would-be illegal migrant might take out a knife, and I should have had the presence of mind to ask where that knife came from, but might take out a knife and stab their own dinghy and all end up in the North Sea. And what I said is, what you could do is rescue them by providing a new boat, a new dinghy. And she said, well, what if they stab that dinghy as well?
Or just jump out.
Or just jump out, whatever. But the argument she was promoting, which was a hypothetical argument,
of course,
which is a ridiculous argument, was that these people are going to habitually and repeatedly put themselves in danger. And out of frustration, I said, well, at some point, you can't infantilise these people. They've got to suffer the consequences
some of them may be
of their own decision. But the reality here is actually pushing boats back works. The Belgians do it. The Belgians do it.
But just to be clear, you did say, whether they did it repeatedly or once...
It was a hypothetical discussion.
You would let them drown.
A gotcha moment, and in frustration at her repeatedly ridiculous assertion that these people are going to harm themselves repeatedly, I said they've got to suffer the consequences of their own actions.
But just to be clear, you would be in favour of rescuing them the first time they...
I would. I actually went on in the interview to say you could give them 5 boats, you could give them 10 boats, handcuff them, put them in a boat. But what they must not be allowed to do is leave safe France at their own volition, make a dangerous journey across the Channel. And by the way, by not stopping the boats and not being robust in our policies in stopping those boats, what we're doing is guaranteeing continued death in the Channel. Because we're encouraging that illegal trade. Can I just finish? We are encouraging the death in Channel. Yeah.
The questioner asked how we were going to tackle reform. I think there's 2 things. First of all, that was dangerous, divisive, dog whistle politics.
No, it wasn't.
There. Pretty clear. The comments about letting people drown in the sea.
No, but I didn't say
appalling.
that.
It's
may suit you to take it out of context.
There's 2 things we need to do with reform, I think. First of all, is we need to expose what they really stand for. They want to abolish the National Health Service and replace it with some kind of private insurance scheme.
No, we do not.
Nigel
You
Farage
haven't read our policies.
Nigel Farage said that.
No, he did not say it.
Which means an awful lot of people who are in seats that just voted reform would no longer be able to access free
well, that's just factually incorrect.
It's not factually incorrect. I'm sorry, I literally heard him say that.
We heard Nigel Farage, didn't we, blame Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine on the West. So instead of standing up to foreign dictators who illegally and brutally invade other countries, he bent down and kissed his boots. That is not standing up to the United Kingdom. That is kowtowing to dictators.
Can I just make the point?
Now, that's part of it.
That's part of it. Irrespective of whether you agree with reform or not, reform got a significant number of votes overnight.
They did.
And so your point, I think, is, so what are you going to do about it? Clearly, reform had been criticised by Labour throughout the campaign, but none. At the same time, they still got a number of votes. So what I was
going to come on to the second point. So tough on reform, tough on the causes of reform, and what is breeding, I think, the drift to populist nationalism is grotesque levels of inequality. If you look at the areas that are most likely to be electing Reform MPs, it's areas that have been completely abandoned for far too long. So Labour's plan to grow the economy, GB Energy will cut energy bills and create jobs. Planning reform will allow economic growth. 1.5 million new homes will provide homes and lower the cost of housing but create jobs everywhere. You have to have regional economic growth. So there's those areas that have been completely left behind and abandoned have some hope in the future. Because I think if you have
there is a
people who
lot of
don't...
mistruth in
If
what he
you
said
have
about
people
reform.
that don't have hope in the future, they cling to a misremembered version of the past. And that nostalgia politics means they're not looking forward. So we have to make the economy work for working people everywhere if we want to tackle the causes of reform.
Daisy, briefly.
So I think a major problem here is that the previous Conservative government completely lost control of the immigration system and completely lost control of the asylum system. And that has enabled the culture in which both immigrants and asylum seekers have been able to be scapegoated to cover up for the government's own failings. And that's the situation we're in. So how would we deal with that? Well, there's two things that we would do. The first is that where we do see that divisive dog whistle rhetoric, we call it out, as we always do, as we always have done, and as we always will continue to do. The second thing is for us to lead on having a sensible discussion about how our immigration and our asylum systems should work. Now, one of the facts that people may know is that in the last financial year, 105,000 visas were given to care workers from other countries to come to this country. Now, I think we should welcome them with open arms and thank them for coming to look after our loved ones and picking up the pieces of a broken social care system. But what Liberal Democrats have been saying is, let's give our own care workers here in the country a higher minimum wage, £2 higher than the minimum wage for everybody else. That would encourage more people in this country to come back to the care sector. It would encourage more people to come into care, and that would naturally reduce the number of people that we would have to ask to come here. So you can welcome people who come here, but invest in the skills in this country at the same time.
We are half an hour in, and I've got quite a few more questions I want to get through. So let me just tell you before I do that we've got one more programme to go before the summer break, as the new government gets its feet under the table. Next week, we're in Colchester in Essex. So if you'd like to be part of that audience, go to the Question Time website. You can follow the instructions there. We would love to see you. And that will be on Thursday at the early time of 7:30 in the evening. So do apply to be part of our audience. Right, Jan Shakan, where are you? Let's hear from you.
With such poor candidates remaining, who is suitable to lead the Conservative Party?
Well, we know where you stand on the argument there, Jansha. I mean, lots of cabinet ministers, was it 8 or something? Yeah. Lost their seats.
More, 11, I think.
Overnight. Who's suitable now to lead the Conservative Party?
I don't know the answer.
I mean, Suella Braverman, obviously, one assumes that she thinks she might be one of them. I'm
yes,
not sure.
she certainly wouldn't be my choice. But the first thing the Conservative Party has to do is to shut up and listen to people and to reflect on the result. And to develop an idea about how it wants to tackle the votes it lost to all sorts of different people. Because I believe that one of the reasons the Conservative Party lost the election so badly was because people felt that it had become a circus and that it wasn't mature and reasonable and moderate and things that people expect from any government. And it lost votes to everybody for that same reason, because it couldn't deliver and it didn't look like a government that was capable of governing. The most important thing is that it now conducts this particular discussion about who its leader should be in that respectful atmosphere. And the last thing that you should start to do is to select somebody before you've had that discussion.
And do you think the system to nominate leaders, correct, i.e. Conservative Party members, choosing the leader, do you think that should
I'm not in favour of that, because I think it was Tony Benn's idea. This originally, that members should vote for the leaders, and he did that because he wanted to bring the parliamentary party of the Labour Party to heel, and everybody's followed suit, and I don't think it's been a good idea, personally. I think in a parliamentary democracy, if you have a lead, and this has happened several times to the Conservative Party, but it also happened, to Labour with Jeremy Corbyn. If the members choose somebody that the MPs don't have confidence in, you've immediately got a constitutional problem. So I doubt very much this, my view, will hold with people are not usually likely to give up their vote, even though I, by the way, am not an MP and I am a member, so I'd be giving up my vote. But I don't think all my fellow members are going to do this. However, that's how I would do it. But as that's not going to happen, let's concentrate on the more practical thing, which is what should the Conservative Party do? And my answer is think first before you say anything.
The question is who's suitable?
Well,
so you must listen. You're on the inside track. Come on, Danny.
Sure.
You must have some idea.
Sure. I genuinely don't know, because I would have to hear from those people who want to put themselves forward to assure myself that they're going to approach this problem in the way that I want to see it, not just where their positioning is. And that's a genuine thing. No one is fit to lead the Conservative Party who isn't capable of addressing the public in this serious way and listening to what the public has said. So I can't answer that. I won't answer the question for that reason.
I absolutely defer to Danny's non-answer because he knows about these things more than me. But it seems to me that the prior problem for the Conservative Party now is what do they do about Nigel Farage? Do they embrace him or do they slam the door on him and try and fight him? And until they answer that question, they don't know what kind of leader they're going to have. I personally think that of all the candidates, I know that James Cleverly has sort of family issues and is uncertain about it. I think he's the underpriced leader here. I think for the Conservatives, it was an absolute disaster to lose Penny Mordaunt, because in terms of a sort of fighting, voluble, impressive and rather popular politician who could relate to people, she was one of the best they've had, and they've lost her. So that's a real blow to them. But of the ones left, I would just put a small bet or a small marker on James Cleverly.
Can I say this thing about reform? It's also an issue for reform. Obviously, reform got to having 14% of the electorate and won 5 seats. So it's miles off being able to govern. And everyone talks about how the Conservative Party needs to unite the right. We've heard 2 things that are interesting. The first is Ben quite openly says he doesn't think reform is a party of the right. And I agree with you. I don't think it is. I think it's a nationalist party. I don't think you would unite the Conservative Party with reform, in my view. And then the question arises, how do you propose to go from your 14% to actually being a governing force while rejecting the whole of the centre of British politics? And the answer is you can't. This idea that you're going to sweep away the Labour Party, no, you're not.
Well, let's just be clear. We got 4 million votes, which is 800,000 more votes than the Liberal Democrats got. We got 5 seats. The Liberal Democrats got 72 seats.
Yes, it's the
so there's
system.
A complete democratic deficit built into the system, which needs to be addressed, number one. Number two, 3 months ago, people were saying, you won't get a single seat, you're just a spoiler party. And I was saying repeatedly, no, we will get seats. The political wind is in our sails. The vast majority of people in this country are small C Conservative. They're proud of this country. They want it to be prosperous, and they want policies made for this country. And we got seats, and we've got to... Yeah. You can decry 5 seats,
well,
but
it's 321 seats away from a majority, isn't it?
Every long march starts with a single step. We got 4 million votes. The Conservative Party, I think, got twice as many votes and about 20 times as many seats as we did.
Yes, it's the electoral system.
Absolutely. It is the electoral system. But the notion that we don't have popular support in the country is a fundamentally flawed notion. What happened last night was the nation went on strike. It was a low turnout. Those who would typically vote for small C Conservative policies stayed at home, and the Labour Party, which got less votes than in 2019, got a thumping majority.
What happened is that
there is not a popular mandate for your form of government.
And there isn't a majority.
For the Conservative Party.
There is a mandate for them.
And there isn't for the Liberal Democrats either.
Well, OK. Thank you for your...
well, it's 3.2 million
Thank you for your interesting contribution. But the Labour Party the Labour Party has a massive majority. We have an electoral system, which I doubt before the... I wouldn't have put Nigel Farage at the top of the list of people favouring proportional representation before this.
Nigel's been talking about proportional representation for years.
Not before it became in his own interest. But the point about it is, this is the electoral system we've got and we're going to keep, and you are miles away from it. So you need other people to contribute. So everyone puts the question to the Conservative Party.
This is sour grapes from a party that doesn't seem to understand how the electoral system works.
We are over the moon with 5 seats, and we will prevail under the existing...
That's my problem with you. We are over the moon with 5 seats.
We have prevailed under the existing system, which prejudices against insurgencies. We've got 5 seats, contrary to all the forecasts, which were that we would get none. And I'm telling you, we are going to get more seats. And you don't have a popular mandate. The Labour Party doesn't have a popular mandate.
Ben,
you've got less votes. You've got less votes than in 2019.
It's the Labour Party that prevailed in the general election yesterday.
This election,
with a pretty sizable majority.
Was none of...
Because
we fought this election in the way that the election is supposed to be fought in order to win as many seats as possible to command a majority in the House of Commons, because that is how British democracy works.
You deny you got less votes.
If it was a presidential system and we were trying to maximise votes nationally for a single figure, we would have fought the campaign.
Did you get less votes than 2019?
The Labour Party prevailed and we won a majority in the House of Commons.
Did you get less votes than...
Hang on, Ben, isn't the point they got a lot more votes than you? I mean, whatever they got in 2019, I mean, it's 2024.
Yeah, it's fine. And we got a lot more votes than the Liberal Democrats.
I'm not denying that, but just in terms of saying that Labour don't have a mandate, I'm just puzzled by your logic.
But surely, the British public, Ben, unlike you, understand how the system works, and they used their votes to make sure that they got a government that could deliver what they want, which is change. Because going up and down the country in the way that I did, this is a country that is crying out for change after the years of chaos that we've had. And that's what they will get. That's what they will get.
Right. So many of you got your hands. I'm wondering where to start. Right, you had your hand up for a while. A little bit further back in the blue shirt, yeah.
I want to come back to Andrew's point about how little we've spoken about the Liberal Democrats in this election. Do you feel that they really could have made a difference if Ed Davies spent more time talking about policy and maybe less time bungee jumping or paddle boarding?
OK, Des, I'll come back to you on that. In fact, I have asked him that myself. He thinks it was the right policy. Can you move a bit further along to the man in the middle in the white shirt? Yeah.
I'm 17 and a member of my local youth council. A few months ago, British Youth Council closed. So what do our leaders think are the ways to improve youth representation? Because in 20, 30, 40 years, we're going to be in all of your seats.
Right. OK. Man here in the front in the green shirt.
Yeah, I just sit here and I watch, and it's just so divisive. Like, there's no conversation about people that are disenfranchised by politics. I myself am, like, veering on the verge of that. Where, especially for Labour, is the hope there? And you talk about change, but it doesn't feel like it. So,
could you elaborate for me on what you mean by disenfranchised?
Well, yeah, I personally, have toyed the line of Labour, Green Party, and I remember 6-7 years ago, before I could vote, of feeling hopeful about this country. I don't feel hope anymore.
And what's driving that? Do you mean in terms of a job, in terms of housing?
I mean, social cohesion, talking to people on the street. I mean, everything. I mean, I've had conversations with people here, and you just the list goes on.
It's true that we've got problems, but my parents are both refugees to this country. They had terrible experiences in their youth. And all I would say is, of course, this country's got problems, but when I understood what they had experienced, I realised that we have an incredible country that we live in. This is not about parties of government or their success or failure. It's a much more general point that I'm making. I'd hope that we'd all agree with that. I think we live in an amazing political democracy. What happened last night, that peaceful change of government, was incredible. Actually, this country, by comparison with lots of periods of its history, is quite prosperous. We do have public services that are available, even for us to debate about whether or not they're good. And so what I would urge is, I don't think that pessimism is completely grounded, fair. And I think one thing, hopefully, that a change of government will do is make people think, well, OK, I can give the country a chance to be optimistic about it again, because I think that's important.
Man in the check shirt there. Yeah.
Yes, thinking about Keir Starmer, where he was consistently talking about change, looking through the optics of how many people voted and how many people voted for Ben Habib's party, I think people heard that they wanted change and they didn't want a two-party system. What they're looking for is actually an alternative.
Here.
An alternative. So let's just look at this for a minute. So Labour got 63% of seats on 34% of the vote. Reform got 14% of the vote and 1% of seats. The Lib Dems got 12% of the vote, but got 11% of the seats. Andrew, you wanted to come in?
I think the big picture here is that if you look, 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, the big two parties absorbed almost all support, almost all voters, way over 80%. And it's now about 60%. So your fundamental point, the two-party system is breaking down, is absolutely right. And I think,
And in terms of the arguments for a different system, I mean, we did have a vote, of course, on a form of proportional representation, the alternative vote, in 2011, and it was rejected by the country then. So that we have had a referendum on that. And what are the arguments for and against?
Well, one of the things that people don't like about the PR system that Ben is suggesting there is that what happens is you get lots and lots of parties, nobody has a majority in the House of Commons, and then you get the classic smoke-filled room stitch-up behind the scenes between the parties to work out who's going to be in power. And people found that very, very hard to understand, opaque, undemocratic. And that is, it also produces very unstable and very odd coalitions. Look at the government of Israel right now, for instance, the most proportional.
Can I just endorse that? I just want to endorse that. Even though we propose PR, what we haven't done is give a specific form of PR. And I think it needs to be looked at very carefully, but I completely agree with you that PR, in its purest form, actually means that the ticket on which parties stand very rarely, if ever, gets delivered, and you have fractious government. I agree.
That is what happens. If you have PR, that's what happens.
Can I pick up some of these points?
Sure, and also you made the point about Ed Davey and his bungee jumping.
So because of the boundary changes, the Liberal Democrats went into this general election notionally with only 8 seats. We've now come out with, we think, 72. And the stunts that Ed Davey did had 2 purposes, really. The first was it actually enabled us to talk about policies. So it enabled us to talk about the NHS. It enabled us to talk about our plans to have mental health experts in every primary and secondary school. It enabled us to talk about our plans to put an end to the sewage scandal. But the second purpose of doing these stunts was because it actually brought some optimism and hope to a general election in which we knew people were really, really struggling. And actually we saw, both through the stunts but also through Ed Davey, our party leader, telling his personal story, that he made a real human connection with people. On this point about disenfranchisement, I completely agree. I do feel as though sometimes the nature of our public debate has become incredibly fractious and broken down, and we've lost the art in British public life of learning how to agree learning how to disagree agreeably, and that's something that I think is a real shame. One of the things you might get under a fairer voting system is that every single vote will count. And particularly when I talk to young people, what I hear is they see the climate crisis, they see the mental health crisis, their life is instantaneous, and politics is slow and it's cumbersome and things don't work. And there seems to be a real disconnect with the way that things work in Westminster than the way they do in communities. And that's why Liberal Democrats want there to be a fairer voting system, but we want more power to be given to local communities so they can affect change as close to where they live as possible.
I thought the bungee jumping was brilliant. I really do.
I'm glad I didn't have to do it.
I thought as a political strategy, it relied on... Ed Davey had a problem, which is people thought he was dull, and he had an advantage, which is actually a very nice person.
Lovely.
And what they did was leverage the advantage to deal with the weakness. And it was very, very intelligent electoral strategy, and I'm sure it helps you win seats.
All right, let's take another question. It's probably going to be our last question, I suspect, from Zaki Kabir. Yes.
This election has seen the rise of a lot of independent candidates standing on the issue of Gaza and taking seats from Labour in doing so. What will Labour learn from this?
So let's just have a little look at this. So Labour lost 4 seats with large Muslim populations to independents. And then you had Wes Streeting, who's now the Health Secretary, only narrowly won.
He lost another 5 seats in total.
Jess Phillips also only narrowly won, both against pro-Gaza candidates. Steve, what will Labour learn from this? Because this was something that was very divisive in the campaign and has clearly cost Labour.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, Labour got an outstanding result. It's one of the best results in our history, only the 4th time ever we've gone from opposition into majority government. So it's a very, very good night overall. But there were areas where we should be concerned about as well, and that's one of them. People who are concerned about Gaza and didn't feel Labour was articulating that. I think that isn't entirely fair myself, because I think Labour's position on Gaza is very, very sensible. It's calling for an immediate ceasefire, respected by both sides, because that is the only way you get a ceasefire. If it's one-sided ceasefire and once the other side keeps fighting, then it simply provokes the battles again. Unimpeded aid, humanitarian food and medicine into Gaza to support the people who are suffering there. The immediate release of hostages by Hamas, because they also have to comply with international law, as should Israel. And then international effort to rebuild Gaza and international effort to work towards the only long-term solution for peace, which is a 2-state solution with a secure Israel alongside a secure Palestine, and both recognising each other. That's Labour's position. It's not how it was characterised.
What about arms sales to Israel?
It's not. Well, as David Lammy has said, that is now the Foreign Secretary, that would depend on whether Israel has actually broken international law, and that hadn't been clear.
What about recognising the state of Palestine?
Well, Keir has said that as well, that we would do that. But it's best done in concert with our allies rather than separately, because if you don't keep the Western allies united around this issue, it's less likely to deliver the outcomes that we want. So I think it's very important to listen to anybody who has concerns about what we have been saying. But I actually think on this issue, Labour's position is a sensible position. It's to work in concert with our allies to bring to an end the immediate cause of the fighting and the killing that is going on, but to work with our allies for that long-term solution that can prevent it ever flaring up again.
Zaki, you asked this question.
I find it very strange to me that when, for example, Keir Starmer came out almost immediately to say that war crimes were being committed in Ukraine by Putin without any kind of verdicts being made by the ICC or the ICJ. But in this case, where both of these things are taking place currently, he seems so unwilling to make any kind of adjudication on that. So why is it the case that there's this seeming double standard going on here?
Well, I don't think it is. I think you do have to follow process in these things, particularly
and
if you are.
Followed process with Ukraine?
I think he has followed process, particularly if you're looking at moving into government. We at that point as an opposition. And as a potential government, which we now are, need to be working in lockstep with our allies. If we just start saying things that don't go along with what our allies are prepared to do, we're not actually helping the people in Gaza.
I'll tell you where would be a good place to have an election about Gaza is Gaza. Okay, so one of the reasons why we're in this situation is because there hasn't been an election in Gaza for many years, and therefore the government of Gaza has been taken over by a murderous fundamentalist cult, and that has caused this conflict. Alongside whatever injustices you want to discuss, and you can't escape the fact that that's the case. We cannot cheer the idea of reform only having 5 seats, and then say, but we have to listen completely to a group of people who got 4 seats. So the view of anyone in the electorate has to be listened to, alongside a broader foreign policy that suits the whole of the country and the whole of the Western world as well. And I hope that Labour Party will listen appropriately to the constituencies, these few constituencies in which this has been a major issue, but will also bear in mind the broader interests of liberal democracy in worldwide.
Ben. Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think there are 2 issues here. The first is exactly what's going on, in Gaza with the bombing of it by Israel and the specific circumstances of that conflict. But what we're talking about is how that's playing out domestically. And what I find quite troubling is that there are many conflicts in this world, including in Libya, where we've got a hand in having destabilized the place, Syria, the Uyghurs, Muslims in China being persecuted, and yet we trade very happily with China. None of these issues have manifested themselves in domestic politics the way Gaza has. And I think that needs real examination. I find it troubling that as an affront, as awful as all the killing is in Gaza, that it manifests itself so dramatically in domestic British politics. And we need to look at what's going on in our own country and why it is that this has become such a big issue.
The woman... Yes, you've got blue hair, I think. Oh, yeah, rather marvellously.
Hi, thank you. My name is Gertrude, and I'm an activist with the One campaign. So I'd like to shift the conversation a bit to UK's role in international development. So with the new Labour Party, what do you think your role will be in combating global issues that my generation is facing, such as climate change, lack of opportunities, and increasing poverty rates?
That's an excellent question. If you don't mind, I'll just stick with Gaza for the moment, just because we're close to running out of time. Daisy.
So the question was about what lessons can Labour learn, but what I've been thinking about a lot recently is what can Parliament learn? So when Russia invaded Ukraine, or had the full invasion of Ukraine, there were a huge variety of views in Parliament about how we should respond, but there were lots of general debates that got us to a point of consensus. But when we had the events of the 7th of October and everything that followed, what we had was lots of political parties using it for political point scoring to expose divisions in each other's parties. Liberal Democrats played no part in that whatsoever. And what's unfortunately happened is we've got to a point, again, in our society where it's a case of whose side are you on? Is it Israelis or Palestinians? Whereas what Liberal Democrats have been saying is we should be in favour of peace, We should be in favour of dignity and peace for all Israelis and Palestinians, and we should stand against the extremes on both sides who want mutual destruction of the other. And only when we can get to that point can we actually advance our calls for an immediate bilateral ceasefire, to get the hostages out, to bring aid to those who desperately need it, and create the political space for a two-state solution. That's where we really need to be.
Woman in the pink top.
I was just wondering, you said it wasn't clear whether Israel were committing war crimes, and that's why we can't currently look at the UK and ceasing arms sales to Israel. But 30,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed, including 11,000 children. There have been bombing of refugee camps and hospitals. What's not clear about that?
War's horrific, and that level of death is horrific, but there is international law, and it would need to be breaches of international law that are committed for a step like that to be taken. The point here is you have to stop the causes of these conflicts. That is best done by getting international pressure to move to a two-state solution, so there is an independent Israel and an independent Palestine, both secure, both recognising each other. This thing keeps flaring up otherwise, and we shouldn't forget the immediate cause of what's going on here either, which was a terrorist group attacked a group of people living in Israel, including young people at a music festival, some of whom who survived it that I met. And Israel's reaction was in response to that. Any country would seek to defend its citizens if they were attacked by a terrorist intervention. The point, though, is how do you get to a position of peace so these things can't happen again?
So, Andrew, this is going to be a challenge for Labour, is
It's
it
going
not?
to be
And
a
a challenge
huge
from the
challenge
left.
for Labour. Look at the number of seats where there were Gaza candidates, and they came quite close. Look at what happened to Jess Phillips, who had a horrible, horrible count last night where she was heckled and abused. Look at the very close call that happened to Wes Streeting, one of the most important figures in the new government, who came within, what, about 700 seats of losing, 700 votes of losing his seat?
528.
528. So this is a really serious issue for the Labour Party. And, you know, Danny Finkelstein was quite rightly talking about Hamas, and this is a murderous cult, and so it is. But at the same time, Israel, partly because of its electoral system, is in the hands of a very, very right-wing, very extreme Prime Minister who is dependent upon even more extreme groups inside Israel. I think he's destroying the reputation of Israel around the world. I think this is a huge issue for the next Labour government, and I think a much more forceful...
You're right that has happened in Israel, but the reason it's happened in Israel is because people like me arguing for a reasonable, moderate government of Israel hit up against the fact that those reasonable, moderate governments in Israel didn't receive a reciprocal response when they tried to tried to do it. In other words, that the peace efforts of Bill Clinton, for example, failed. And after that, of course, Israel ended up electing governments of that kind, which I agree with you. You know, they
utterly destructive to Israel's reputation.
Completely. That's what happens, however, when there was no peace, even when a reasonable approach was made. And we cannot have this discussion when we don't when we assume that there's only one set of grievances in this and there's only one set of rights and wrongs. The problem here is not lots of wrongs, it's two rights, right? It's two people who want to form a state and have the right to do that in one area. And after the Second World War, there was nowhere for Jews to go, and they've ended up... Now, half the Jews in the world live there. That cannot be removed. But also the Palestinians have rights there. And until we stop just saying, I've got the best case, we have been the worst affected by these outrages, and then we can each exchange this. We can have a propaganda sheet where you've got one and I've got one, and we read them at each other, and it gets absolutely nowhere. And the result is that in both cases, everyone's just become more extreme and more dug in. And Labour's got to try to look at that, insofar as Britain has a role at all, rather than just getting itself in the position of thinking, well, we nearly lost Wes Streeting's seat, therefore we've got to take one particular position.
All right. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you with your hands up because our hour is up. This is our first question time with the new government. There will be many more to come, not least next week, because next week we will be in Colchester. So if you want to be in our audience, do apply. But for now, our first question time after the election. Thank you very much for coming on to our panel. Thank you very much to all of you for coming and taking part. And, of course, thank you to you at home for watching. From Question Time, bye-bye.